Like a lot of people, I played a lot more video games, both good and bad, when I was a kid than I do now. Part of the reason for this was that my friends tended to have game systems that I didn't, like the original PlayStation, and I used to play a lot of games at their houses. This is why, even though I owned only Nintendo consoles until after finishing college, I have many fond memories of such decidedly non-Nintendo franchises as ToeJam and Earl, Crash Bandicoot, Rayman, and of course Squaresoft's storytelling tour de force, Chocobo Racing. But another reason I played a lot of weird games back then was that I grew up during the golden age of rental games, which I would rummage through the local Blockbuster while the rest of my family was wondering whether we should pick up Casper or Jumanji. One of these games was a personal favorite of mine, even though I never owned it. Kirby 64. I loved everything about this game. The laid-back gameplay, the endless variety of copy abilities, the goofy appearance of the characters, everything. But one of the most unique aspects of Kirby 64 was something that only really hit me in hindsight, and that was how the levels were designed. You see, in Kirby 64, each level is technically two-dimensional, in that you can only move forward and backward along a fixed axis. However, that axis doesn't just go left and right. Instead, the perspective of the camera moves around to give the impression of three-dimensional movement, kind of like that old Max Fleischer cartoon I showed you back in my Cuphead video. They had a name for this kind of game back then: 2.5D. It wasn't quite 3D, since there was no free movement around a simulated 3D environment, but it wasn't strictly 2D either, because characters and objects would move between the background and foreground as you progressed. Recently I was feeling nostalgic for some of the old 2.5D games I used to play, so I decided to look them up on Google, which instantly provided me with the following selection of classic 2.5D games. Yes, such classics of the genre as Shadow Complex, which is an entirely 2D Metroidvania, Mega Man 11, which, again, is just a 2D platformer where you only go left and right, and then Wolfenstein 3D and Duke Nukem 3D, which... I really don't have to explain what's wrong with this, do I? It turns out that 2.5D is about as vague and poorly defined a term as RPG was back in the 90s. Remember when you had that one gamer friend who was absolutely adamant that Zelda was an RPG and would not be convinced otherwise? And then when you told him it wasn't, he would go, "But RPG means role-playing game, and in Zelda you're playing a character, so that makes it an RPG," which was friggin' ridiculous, because by that standard every game ever made is an RPG, except maybe Tetris. Okay, maybe that was just me. Anyway, it turns out that some otherwise sensible authorities, most notably Wikipedia, have decided that 2.5D just means a 2D game that either has 3D rendered graphics or simulates the appearance of a 3D world. It cites Zaxxon, one of the first isometric shooters, as an early example of the 2.5D style. The problem with this is that we already have a term for games like Zaxxon, which I literally just used: isometric. This is the term I've always heard used to describe games like A Link to the Past or Golden Sun, which trick your brain into thinking they're 3D with a tilted screen perspective. As for 2D games that have 3D rendered graphics, that's kind of absurd. Donkey Kong Country has pseudo-3D graphics, but functionally it's 100% a 2D platformer, with the only thing separating it from, say, Sonic the Hedgehog being more aesthetically pleasing sprites. I have a completely different idea of what 2.5D means, and I realize this isn't industry approved, but give me a second to outline it here. 2.5D to me is when a game only lets you go backward and forward along a fixed path, but it moves the path around so that your character ends up moving through a 3D space. This allows the game to follow 2D design conventions while also making the levels more visually interesting. Think about it this way. Most 2D games are actually set in a fictional 3D world. It just so happens that you're only moving across one straight line that runs through it. This is why in Mega Man X you can see a city in the background of the first level. You never actually get to explore the city, but the game wants you to know that it exists. In a 2.5D game, the level design actually routes you through that background, so it feels even more real. Obviously, this isn't the only way to simulate 3D without giving the player full freedom of movement. Wolfenstein 3D and its ilk, for instance, flipped the 2D axis on its side by letting you run around freely on the horizontal plane, but not letting you move up or down. Isometric design, probably the most popular way of simulating 3D, uses diagonal movement to pretend that your character is moving vertically, although sometimes this ends up backfiring in silly ways. In fact, 2.5D as I've described it is pretty rare, so rare that I imagine a lot of gamers have never played a game that used it. Well, I'm going to do you guys a solid. To finish this side note, here's 5 2.5D games that you should play as soon as you get the chance. Number 1. Klonoa Door to Phantom Isle. As far as I can tell, this is close to the first game to ever use 2.5D, as I've defined it anyway. It's also one of the best. Klonoa is like a storybook come to life, with beautiful visuals, lots of unique puzzles, and a story that, while not very deep or complicated, manages to tug on the old heartstrings pretty damn hard. The sequel, Lunatea's Veil, is also a great time, but Door to Phantomile is the classic. Number 2. Beautiful Joe. I talked about this game plenty in my Kamiya 3 video, so I'll just cover the basics here. Beautiful Joe is a thrilling combination of beat-em-up and platformer where you play as a movie nerd turned superhero whose powers are based on film techniques. It's challenging, really funny, and has some of the weirdest dialogue I've ever heard in a video game. Just go for it. You'll be glad that you did. Number 3. Kirby Planet Robobot. I mentioned before that Kirby 64 had 2.5D graphics, but it's far from the only Kirby game to use that style. This 3DS outing deserves serious praise for flipping a few classic Kirby mechanics around and making them fresh again, some really inspired level geometry that makes the most of the 2.5D style, and a plot that actually has some depth to it, which, in case you aren't aware, is not a common thing for Kirby games. Squeak Squad, for instance, starts with Kirby chasing after a bunch of mice because they stole his cake, and that pretty much sums it up. Don't get me wrong, I love Kirby games, but their stories make Tom and Jerry cartoons look like epic poetry by comparison. Not Planet Robobot, though. Number 4. Puppeteer. One of the last games released for the PS3, Puppeteer has a really unique combat system based on a pair of magic scissors wielded by the hero, a boy whose soul was sucked out of his body and put into a wooden puppet by an evil bear that lives on the moon. That's one of the less outlandish details of this game's story, by the way. Like Klonoa, it has a very strong storybook atmosphere. Unlike Klonoa, Puppeteer has more than a couple dozen lines of dialogue. Honestly, watching the cutscenes in this game is about as much fun as playing it, and that's not an insult. And finally, number 5, Killer 7. Seriously, this is a 2.5D game. You move forward and backward along a set of fixed paths in a 3D environment. And if that revelation didn't blow your mind, then the game will certainly do that for me. The best way I can describe Killer 7 is that it's mature, not in the sex and gore sense, although there's certainly plenty of that, more the really dark and confusing sense. But it's also just a really enjoyable game with satisfying combat and a lot of interesting characters. There really is nothing else like it. Anyway, back to the video proper.